It was a bitter, cold winter night in 1457 AD, and the wind howled with such intensity that it seemed to pierce through the very stones of Bleau Castle. The cries of a young girl echoed down the dark, narrow corridors, as if the very castle walls were mourning with her. Inside her chamber, lit only by the flickering glow of candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort lay on the verge of death, her body racked with the excruciating pains of childbirth. The midwives gathered around her, their faces drawn and pale in the dim light, whispering Latin prayers under their breath. There was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. This was a battle between life and death. Outside, the snow fell in relentless sheets, blanketing the frozen ground of Bedfordshire. But inside, amidst the desperate cries of a girl too young to be a mother, history was being forged. Margaret's small hands gripped the bloodied sheets beneath her, her frail body convulsing in agony that no child should ever endure. With each wave of pain, she felt her strength ebbing away, her body too small for the task she had been thrust into. Her breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, it seemed like she might slip away, leaving nothing behind but an empty room filled with sorrow. But Margaret's pain was not in vain. The child she carried was destined to be England's future king, a king whose reign would not only alter the course of English history, but would forever change the trajectory of the world itself. The boy born in such agony, Henry Tudor, would one day sit upon the throne of England, his ascension marking the end of one of the bloodiest conflicts the kingdom had ever seen. The War of the Roses was about to come to a close, and the Tudors, through Margaret's suffering, would rise to power, beginning a new dynasty that would forever reshape the nation. The irony of the situation was not lost on those present in the chamber. The fate of England was being determined in this room, in the body of a girl whose future had been set upon a path of unimaginable sacrifice. Margaret's scream, a cry of anguish and defiance, was not just the cry of a mother in labor, but a sound that would echo down the centuries as the future of the kingdom was torn from her body. For Margaret, it was more than just a physical ordeal. It was a sacrifice that would shape the rest of her life. She too was a child, barely a woman. Yet here she was, forced to bring forth a child who would carry the bloodline of the kings of England. She was a daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, whose legacy was marred by political turmoil and military failure. Margaret had inherited her father's blood that ran through the veins of the great John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III. But royal blood in 15th century England was not a blessing. It was a dangerous thing to possess, for it made you either a valuable pawn or a target in the savage game of power that played out on the battlefield and in the courts of England. As Margaret lay in that room, her body racked with pain, it was hard to imagine the woman she would become. A queen mother, a survivor, a political strategist who would weather the storms of civil war, marriage, betrayal, and the constant threat of death. She was about to embark on a journey of incredible sacrifice, cunning, and ambition that would ultimately see her son crowned as the king who would unite the warring houses of York and Lancaster. But none of this was clear yet, as Margaret writhed in pain. The world beyond the castle walls was unaware of the drama unfolding within. The midwives, grim and resigned, continued their work, while outside the storm raged on. But inside, in the heart of Bleau Castle, the birth of a king was in progress, and Margaret's scream, a cry that tore through the cold night, marked the beginning of a new chapter in England's long and turbulent history. The blood that flowed through Margaret Beaufort's veins was no ordinary blood. It was royal blood, a bloodline that had once been as mighty as it was dangerous. Her lineage traced back to one of the most significant figures in English history, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. As the fourth son of King Edward III, Gaunt's descendants held a precarious claim to the throne, one that would make Margaret both a pawn and a key player in the upcoming wars that tore England apart. The wars in question, the Wars of the Roses, were a brutal and bitter conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. The Lancastrians, represented by the Red Rose, were led by Margaret's own family, the Beauforts, who were connected to the royal bloodline through John of Gaunt's marriage to his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Margaret's own father, John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, was a man haunted by the political and military failures of his time. His connection to this turbulent royal bloodline placed Margaret at the heart of the struggle for the English crown, whether she wanted to be or not. The political landscape of 15th century England was unstable, and royal blood was a dangerous inheritance. Margaret was born into a world where alliances shifted like the wind, and marriages were arranged not out of love, but as a strategic tool in the ongoing war for power. Margaret's very existence made her both a valuable pawn and a potential threat. As a descendant of Gaunt, she had a claim to the throne of England, a claim that would come to mean little in the face of the deadly conflict that loomed. Her bloodline, once a symbol of royal prestige, had become a symbol of potential destruction in the unforgiving world of noble politics. It was into this world of shifting alliances and political intrigue that Margaret was born in May 1443 A.D., in a turbulent England torn apart by civil war. Her early years were marked by the instability surrounding her family's position. Her father, John Beaufort, had served as a commander during the final stages of the 100 Years' War, where England lost more territory in France, a crushing blow to the Lancastrian cause. The failure of the Lancastrians in France and the loss of key territories under the reign of Henry VI had left the family's honor tarnished. Some accounts of John Beaufort's death in 1444 suggest that the loss drove him to madness, while others whisper of poison. Whatever the cause, it left Margaret fatherless at a tender age, setting her on a path shaped by others' ambitions. For young Margaret, these early years were clouded by the consequences of her father's death. His body was found in his chambers at Wimborne Minster, the cause of death officially recorded as fever. But those closest to him knew better, and rumors of poison, of a man too broken by failure to live, clouded Margaret's memory of her father. His death cast a long shadow over her childhood, and as she grew, Margaret would learn that the price of her bloodline, royal yet fragile, was the constant threat of violence, betrayal, and manipulation. Margaret's youth was far from a simple fairy tale. Her life was defined not by games and laughter, but by survival in an unstable world, a world where power was always shifting, and where the death of a parent was often the beginning of a new political struggle. By the time she was 6 years old, her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, understood all too well that survival in this environment meant ensuring that her daughter was married off to solidify alliances. And so, by 1449, young Margaret was betrothed to John Depole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, an alliance that was meant to strengthen both their claims to the throne. But the swift turn of fortune that would shape Margaret's future soon took its course. Suffolk, once a powerful figure, was murdered in 1450, dragged from his ship, forced to kneel, and beheaded with a rusty sword by political enemies. His death, brutal and sudden, was but one more chapter in the dangerous game of thrones, where alliances shifted as quickly as life could be snatched away. Margaret's betrothal, which had seemed so promising, was nullified with his death. In a world where nobility was only as valuable as the political ties they could forge, Margaret's position grew even more precarious. But in the world of political maneuvering, new opportunities arose just as quickly as old ones crumbled. Margaret's future would no longer lie with the now deceased Duke of Suffolk. Instead, her family moved quickly to secure her future elsewhere. In yet another marriage meant to strengthen alliances that would keep their line alive and powerful. It would be to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a man whose future as a member of the royal family would depend on the fragile threads of dynastic marriages and political favor. Little did Margaret know, however, that this would be the first of many trials to come, each more painful than the last. The child who had been promised to a union of power would soon find herself caught between the bloody factions of Lancaster and York, her destiny dictated not by her own desires, but by a bloodline that could both elevate her and destroy her. Margaret Beaufort's childhood was marked by one tragic event after another, each one shaping her future in ways she could neither understand nor control. She was born into a world teetering on the edge of chaos. As a child, she should have been playing in the gardens of Bleau Castle, learning the gentle arts of needlework and music, yet her life was already defined by a backdrop of war, betrayal, and the constant shifting of allegiances. Her father's early death set the stage for a life where security was a fleeting illusion, and the stability of her youth was shattered by the winds of political change. The circumstances surrounding John Beaufort's demise in 1444 were steeped in mystery. The official story was that he died from a fever, a common enough cause of death in those days. Yet, for those who had known him, those who had witnessed his decline after military defeats in France during the 100 Years' War, the fever was but a convenient cover for deeper and darker truths. Whispers of poison, whispers of a man too broken by failure and the weight of his own guilt, haunted the young Margaret's early memories. John Beaufort had once been a promising military leader, sent to France to protect the territories England had gained under the mighty Henry VI. But as the years passed and territories slipped from English hands, John's spirit withered. He returned to England a broken man in 1444, hollow-eyed and trembling, spending hours lost in silence. It is said that he rarely spoke, ate even less, and spent long stretches staring at nothing. His tragic end, whether from poison, despair, or some dark conspiracy, left a young girl with a legacy of instability, the echoes of a father's failure haunting her every step. The death of her father thrust Margaret into a world where survival was an art, and the price of survival was often paid in the currency of political marriages. The strategic value of her bloodline could not be ignored, but her youth meant that the cost would fall on her body, on her future. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, understood the importance of securing Margaret's position in the turbulent political landscape of 15th century England. The political landscape was anything but forgiving. It was a land where children were married off not for love, but for alliances that might one day determine the future of nations. At just 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to John Deppel, son of the Duke of Suffolk, a marriage designed to strengthen the family's position within the power struggles that had engulfed the kingdom. The arrangement seemed to be a promising one, an alliance between two noble houses in the hopes of securing Margaret's place within the shifting tides of power. But such alliances were fragile things in the world of the Wars of the Roses, and the sudden and violent death of Suffolk in 1450 left Margaret's marriage contract in ruins. Suffolk's murder was nothing short of brutal. According to some accounts, he was dragged from his ship and forced to kneel by political enemies. A rusty sword, clumsy in its strikes, was used to sever his head in a grisly execution. His death was the latest in a series of violent acts that underscored the merciless nature of the politics of the time. The death of her betrothed left Margaret, still a child, vulnerable to the whims of a rapidly shifting world. In a matter of months, Margaret was left without the promise of a secure future. Her family's power was tied to her ability to form strategic alliances, and with her betrothal to Depol now void, she was at the mercy of whatever political marriages could be arranged next. The devastation of her father's death, followed by the collapse of her first marriage contract, was a bitter beginning to a life that would be filled with even more uncertainty. As the conflict between the Lancastrians and Yorkists continued to burn through the kingdom, Margaret's future became even more precarious. Her bloodline, though royal, was no guarantee of safety or power. It would take more than noble birth and strategic marriages to survive the deadly wars that were about to engulf England. It would take a cunning mind, a heart of steel, and the will to do whatever necessary to ensure the survival of her family, her bloodline, and most importantly, the child she carried, Henry Tudor, the future King of England. Margaret's youth was stolen by the fires of war, her childhood crushed under the weight of dynastic politics. But even at this young age, Margaret would begin to show the traits that would define her later life: resilience, intelligence, and an unwavering determination to survive. Traits that would ultimately allow her to shape the destiny of a nation. At the tender age of 6, Margaret Beaufort's fate was already being decided by forces far beyond her control. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, had recognized early on that the only way to secure her daughter's future in the treacherous world of 15th century England was through strategic alliances that were made and broken in the blink of an eye. So, at an age when most children were still clinging to their innocence, Margaret was already bound by a marriage contract to John Depol, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. It was an alliance that promised stability, security, and above all, an unbreakable connection to one of the most powerful families in England. But as in all things in the brutal political landscape of the Wars of the Roses, nothing was ever as certain as it seemed. Suffolk's fate was sealed not by any grand battle or noble confrontation, but by a simple, sudden betrayal. A betrayal that left Margaret once again vulnerable in a world she had no power to control. The Duke of Suffolk had made one fatal mistake. He had become a target. Suffolk's crime was not one of treason or ambition, but of overstepping the boundaries of the political elite. His negotiations with the French, particularly concerning the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou and the surrender of lands like Maine and Anjou to the French, were deeply unpopular with both the nobility and the common people. It was seen as an affront to English pride and honor, a betrayal of the very ideals for which the kingdom had fought during the 100 Years' War. The discontent with Suffolk's actions was palpable, and the anger of the English people would have tragic consequences. In 1450, Suffolk was brutally murdered, his life snatched away by a violent and gruesome act. According to contemporary accounts, he was dragged from his ship by political enemies, pirates or disgruntled nobles, depending on which story one believed. Forced to kneel on the deck, his captors swung a rusty sword to sever his head. The blow didn't come easily. Suffolk's head was cleaved with 6 painful strikes, an image of incompetence and violence that mirrored the political turmoil of the time. His death was more than just the end of one man's life. It was a symbol of the fragility of power in this violent, unstable period. Suffolk's murder meant the sudden end of Margaret's first marriage contract, leaving her betrothal to Depol, a carefully arranged union between 2 powerful families. Nothing more than a worthless piece of paper. Her future, once secured by this marriage, was now thrown into uncertainty. The world Margaret lived in was one where personal bonds were fragile and could be severed by a sword stroke. The murder of Suffolk was just another reminder that the only certainty in the world was the ever-present specter of violence and betrayal. For Margaret, it was another harsh lesson in survival. The lives of the nobility, her family included, were constantly at risk, their futures determined not by birthright alone, but by the ability to navigate the shifting tides of power. She had already learned that a marriage contract was a weapon, but Suffolk's death taught her that alliances could be just as easily destroyed as they were forged. Margaret's life was increasingly defined by the necessity to adapt, to survive, and to do whatever was required to secure her place in the fractured world she inhabited. As the years wore on, the political landscape only grew more volatile. The Lancastrian cause, which Margaret and her family had supported, was increasingly under siege from the rising Yorkists. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal and bloody conflict between the two factions, was already underway. But for Margaret, her survival would depend not just on the outcome of battles, but on her ability to outlast the betrayals and shifting allegiances that defined the court of Henry VI. Margaret's personal alliances would continue to shift, her own fate caught in the struggle for the crown of England. In the wake of Suffolk's betrayal and death, Margaret's future seemed bleak. Her first marriage, already a casualty of the political storm, was gone. Her bloodline, though royal, was no guarantee of safety. But Margaret had learned the crucial lesson of survival. She would need to adapt, to bend with the winds of fate if she were to navigate the dangers ahead. The Game of Thrones in England was no longer just about royal blood. It was about power, influence, and the ability to secure alliances before they were destroyed by betrayal. Margaret Beaufort's life, shaped by tragedy, death, and betrayal, was now irrevocably linked to the turbulent fate of England. At just 12 years old, she was once again thrust into the political maelstrom that defined the Wars of the Roses. This time through a marriage that would have profound consequences for her family and for the kingdom. In 1455, just a year after her first marriage contract was shattered by the brutal death of John Depol's father, Margaret was betrothed to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Edmund was the half-brother of King Henry VI, a man whose position at court was both precarious and powerful. As a member of the Lancaster family, Edmund's marriage to Margaret was not just a union of hearts. It was a calculated political move, one that would unite two key branches of the Lancaster bloodline. But as with most political marriages in this era, love was not the driving force. Margaret, still a child, was not prepared for the realities of what was expected of her. Edmund, seasoned by the turmoil of the time, was a man in his 20s, hardened by political maneuvering and military campaigns. He was far removed from the world of the innocent child Margaret still was, and their union was one marked not by tenderness, but by the brutal expectations of dynastic ambition. The wedding ceremony took place at Bleo Castle, the same ancestral home where Margaret had spent much of her childhood. The hall was filled with the powerful symbols of the Beaufort family's past. Tapestries depicting her ancestors' deeds and the tomb of her grandfather, John Beaufort, a man who had once held the title of Earl of Somerset. But despite the grandeur of the occasion, the wedding was anything but a joyful celebration for Margaret. The child bride, dressed in a gown that seemed far too large for her small frame, was married to Edmund in a ceremony that marked the beginning of a painful journey, a journey she would not have chosen for herself. For Edmund, this marriage was an essential step in securing his own claim to power. The Tudors were a relatively recent family in the eyes of the old nobility. Though their bloodline could be traced back to Welsh gentry, Their legitimacy was often questioned by the more established families of England. But the marriage to Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, bolstered Edmund's standing and aligned him with one of the most powerful houses in the kingdom. The Tudor line, for all its newfound power, needed the legitimacy and influence that came with Margaret's bloodline. However, the political motivations behind the marriage were not the only force at play. Edmund and Margaret's union also had another, darker consequence. Within months of their marriage, Margaret's body began to show signs of change. She was growing into womanhood, but she was still just a child. Her body, still unprepared for the rigors of childbirth, began to swell with the growing life inside her. It was a terrifying development. In an age where childbirth was a perilous and often deadly event, Margaret's youth made her a prime candidate for a fate that had claimed many before her. Her mother, too, watched with increasing anxiety as Margaret's pregnancy progressed. Margaret's mother, who had been 18 when Margaret was born, was familiar with the perils of childbirth. But Margaret was just 12, and her body was still developing. She had not yet grown into the physical maturity required to bear a child safely. Yet here she was, pregnant, just months after her marriage to Edmund Tudor. The reality of Margaret's situation began to sink in. The old traditions of medieval society left little room for consideration of a young girl's health and well-being. Women in Margaret's position were not asked whether they were ready for the physical, emotional, and psychological toll that would come with being a mother. Instead, they were seen as instruments of dynastic survival, vessels for carrying heirs to power. Margaret's personal happiness, her body, and her health were secondary to the needs of the kingdom. The burden of this reality became painfully evident when Edmund Tudor left for Wales to lead campaigns against the Yorkists. His absence only heightened Margaret's growing fears. She was alone, pregnant, and terrified. And when Edmund was captured in 1456, the world that had once seemed so rigidly structured, where marriage and alliances were the keys to power, began to crumble once again. Edmund's capture and death became the beginning of yet another chapter of tragedy in Margaret's life. Left a widow at the age of 13, pregnant with the child who would one day become Henry VII, Margaret was once again thrust into the unforgiving political landscape of 15th century England. She was alone, vulnerable, and faced with the overwhelming task of ensuring the survival of her son and her own. Margaret's marriage to Edmund Tudor had been more than just a union between two people. It was a crucial piece of the intricate puzzle of political power. The bloodlines of both families were now forever intertwined, and the birth of her child, though fraught with peril, had become the only hope for the future of the Lancastrian cause. But the death of Edmund and the loss of his support left Margaret more isolated than ever. As the war between the Yorkists and Lancastrians raged on, she would have to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics on her own. The death of her husband had left her with little more than her own determination, and the unborn child she carried, the future Henry VII, who would one day become the king that ended the Wars of the Roses and founded the Tudor dynasty. Her journey, however, was far from over. She was no longer simply a child caught in the machinations of others. She had become a player in a far more dangerous game. The survival of her family, her son, and the future of England would depend on her ability to adapt, to survive, and to outmaneuver those who sought to destroy her and her line. The year was 1456, and Margaret Beaufort found herself thrust into a harsh reality she was too young to fully comprehend. Widowed at just 13 years old, pregnant with her late husband's child, and alone in a world on the brink of collapse, Margaret was now a widow in a country teetering on the edge of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had already begun their deadly course, and the bitter conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York was consuming England. The Lancastrian cause, which Margaret had supported through her marriage to Edmund Tudor, was faltering. The reigning king, Henry VI, was weak and often incapacitated by illness, leaving the kingdom without a strong ruler. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was capable but deeply unpopular with the nobility, who blamed her for England's military failures in France. The Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, seized the opportunity, claiming that the throne rightfully belonged to them. This was the beginning of a bloody conflict that would devastate the country for decades. Margaret's life, once shaped by promises of power and wealth through marriage, had been torn apart by the brutal realities of war. She was now a widow, and with Edmund's death, her son, Henry Tudor, was at risk of being forgotten in the chaotic power struggles. Yet Margaret, despite her youth and grief, was not one to simply fade into the background. She had inherited her mother's shrewdness, her father's resilience, and the blood of kings that flowed through her veins. Margaret's survival would depend not just on her bloodline, but on her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of a kingdom divided by civil war. As the months passed, Margaret's pregnancy continued to weigh heavily on her, both physically and emotionally. She had no choice but to carry on. It was her duty, not only to her family, but to the Lancastrian cause. Edmund's death had left her with a child who represented the only hope for the future of the Lancaster family. If Henry Tudor was to survive, Margaret would have to navigate this storm alone. The Yorkists were growing in power, and every day that passed brought the threat of violence closer to home. While the kingdom was on the brink of collapse, Margaret sought refuge in Pembroke Castle, her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor's stronghold. Jasper, ever loyal to the Lancastrian cause, took Margaret in, offering her protection in the midst of the growing chaos. Pembroke Castle, perched on the cliffs of Pembrokeshire, was a stronghold of ancient stone and cold winds. A fitting place for a woman whose life had been defined by loss and survival. The winter months brought even more harshness to the landscape, as snow fell thick and fast, and the sea winds howled like the ghosts of the past. The journey to Pembroke Castle was difficult for Margaret. Her pregnancy now advanced. She traveled in a litter, jolted over rutted roads that were barely passable. Each bump and jolt sent waves of pain through her body. But there was no time for rest. The world around her was on fire, and she had no choice but to endure. Jasper, who had grown fond of his sister-in-law, was determined to protect her and her unborn child at all costs. He had no way of knowing what would come next, but he understood that Margaret's survival and the survival of her child was crucial to the Lancastrian cause. When Margaret finally arrived at Pembroke Castle, the relief of being inside the castle's cold stone walls offered little comfort. The castle was a fortress, designed for survival rather than comfort. Its towering keep had withstood centuries of storms and sieges, but it offered little warmth in the harsh winter months. Margaret's chambers were cold, and the fire that burned in the hearth seemed to do little to ward off the chill that permeated the walls. Yet, here, in this remote fortress, Margaret would face the most harrowing challenge of her life: childbirth. The physician who had been summoned to attend Margaret, a learned man who had studied at Oxford and Paris, was deeply concerned. He examined her with growing alarm, noting that Margaret's body was simply not prepared for the stresses of childbirth. At just 13 years old, her body was still that of a child, not yet fully grown. Her hips were too narrow, the baby too large, and the birth would almost certainly be a difficult one. The physician, Dr. Louis Carleon, had delivered many babies during his career, but never one as young as Margaret. He confided in Jasper Tudor, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The situation, he said, was grim. If Margaret survived the birth, the baby might not. If the baby survived, Margaret might not. The chilling reality of Margaret's situation was impossible to ignore. She was trapped in a cruel and dangerous predicament. A child giving birth to another child, both caught in a struggle that was beyond their control. The castle's walls were filled with whispers of concern, and the midwives, experienced women who had attended countless births, knew that the odds were stacked against Margaret. They had seen this before, and they knew that childbirth at such a young age was often a death sentence. But Margaret's resolve was unwavering. She had survived the death of her father, the betrayal of her marriage, and the constant threat of political upheaval. She would survive this too. The child she carried was not just a son, he was the last hope for the Lancastrian cause. Margaret knew that the future of England's throne rested in the small hands of the child she was about to bear. In the days that followed, Margaret's condition worsened. Her labor began in earnest, and the pain that racked her body was unlike anything she had ever known. The midwives worked tirelessly, but the hours stretched on with no sign of progress. Margaret's strength was beginning to fail, her cries of pain echoing through the stone halls. Her body, so small and fragile, was being torn apart by the effort to bring forth a child who would one day wear a crown. As Margaret labored through the long hours, the men outside her chamber paced nervously. Jasper Tudor, unable to sit still, walked the corridors of the castle, his heart heavy with fear. The future of the Lancastrian line and of England itself hung in the balance. The cries from inside the chamber grew louder, and the walls seemed to shudder with each passing moment. In those dark, cold hours, as the castle walls groaned with the weight of the storm outside, Margaret's strength faltered, but her will remained unbroken. She knew what was at stake: her own life, the life of her son, and the future of a kingdom. The battle for survival was being fought not just in the bloodied fields of England, but in the chambers of Pembroke Castle. And Margaret, despite her youth and pain, was determined to win it. The night seemed to stretch on forever in Pembroke Castle as Margaret Beaufort's body fought against the impossible. Her labor, already long and agonizing, showed no signs of slowing down. The cold, damp air inside the castle's stone walls felt like it was closing in around her, adding to the oppressive weight of the hours. Every breath Margaret took was a struggle, her body racked with pain that no child should have to endure. But Margaret wasn't just any child. She was a daughter of royal blood, a descendant of John of Gaunt, and her destiny had always been tied to something greater than herself. And now, in the shadow of the great walls of Pembroke Castle, that destiny would unfold in the most dramatic way imaginable. The room where Margaret lay was lit only by the flickering glow of candles, casting long shadows against the ancient stone walls. The midwives moved about in a practiced, almost mechanical way, their faces tight with worry, yet determined. They knew the risks. They had seen many births, but this one was different. The situation was dire. Margaret's body was too young, too small, and the baby she carried was too large, positioned incorrectly in the womb. The very act of childbirth was a battle, one that could easily claim both mother and child. Dr. Louis Carleon, the physician summoned to attend Margaret, paced outside the chamber, his mind racing through the options. He was no stranger to difficult births, but this one was unlike any he had encountered. His experience with women of noble birth, queens and commoners alike, told him that Margaret's chances of survival were slim. The baby, a future king, was in distress, and Margaret's body was beginning to fail her. Her pulse was weak, her skin pale, and she was bleeding, both internally and externally, at an alarming rate. Dr. Carleon had few options left. A cesarean section, a procedure he had only attempted on rare occasions, was the only solution, but it carried a near certain risk of death for the mother. But what choice did he have? The Lancastrian cause hung on this child, and Margaret's survival was just as crucial. The entire future of England could be decided in this very room, in this excruciating struggle for life. Inside, Margaret, though nearly overcome by exhaustion, was still conscious, clinging to the belief that she could survive. Every instinct in her young body screamed for rest, for release, but she refused to give in. She had been through so much already. Her father's mysterious death, the broken promise of marriage, the loss of her husband, then now this brutal test of endurance. She would not let it end here. The child she carried, the future of the Lancastrian bloodline, needed to be born. She would endure this suffering for him, for her family, for England. The midwives worked with quiet urgency, using every method at their disposal to ease her labor. They tried positioning techniques, massaging Margaret's abdomen, whispering words of encouragement, and applying herbs meant to ease the pain. But nothing seemed to make a difference. The hours passed, each one heavier than the last, as the pain intensified. Margaret's strength began to wane, her young body weakening under the strain. Yet she clung to the belief that the birth was not just a personal ordeal. It was a national imperative. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, the waiting was agony in its own right. Jasper Tudor, Margaret's brother-in-law, was consumed with anxiety, pacing the cold stone corridors of Pembroke Castle. His steps echoed in the silence, each one a reminder of the stakes at hand. The child Margaret carried was not just a boy. He was the hope of the Lancastrian cause, the future King of England, the one who would one day sit on the throne and end the civil war that had torn the kingdom apart. Jasper could not afford to lose him. Not now, not after all they had sacrificed. Hours stretched on into the night, and the cries from within Margaret's chamber grew more frantic. The midwives exchanged nervous glances, their faces drawn with the weight of the decisions they had to make. Finally, Dr. Carleon was called in. He had been summoned from his restless sleep, his eyes bleary with fatigue. But he knew the moment had arrived. They would have to attempt the procedure. It was dangerous, but it was the only chance Margaret had left. The air in the room was thick with tension as the decision was made. The midwives cleared a space around Margaret, and Carleon prepared for what would be an agonizing procedure. His heart raced in his chest. The risks were overwhelming, but there was no turning back now. As he made the incision, every moment seemed to stretch out in slow motion, each second hanging heavy with the weight of what was at stake. The room fell silent, save for the sounds of the procedure and the anxious whispers of the women who hovered at the edges of the chamber. Margaret's screams had faded, her energy nearly gone, and she clung to consciousness only by sheer force of will. For a long moment, there was no sound at all, just a thick, breathless pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a faint, weak cry pierced the air, a sound that shattered the silence like a glass breaking. The baby had been born. He was alive. But the relief was short-lived. The child, barely breathing, was rushed to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. It was a small, fragile thing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a moment, Margaret's exhausted eyes locked onto the tiny form that had been torn from her body still trembling from the agony of the birth. Despite the haze of pain and weakness that enveloped her, she reached out instinctively for the child, her arms shaking with the effort. The midwife, Dame Gwen, placed the baby in Margaret's arms for a brief moment. Just enough time for mother and child to make a fleeting connection. Margaret's eyes fluttered as she gazed at her newborn son, the future Henry VII. But the exertion was too much. Her body, shattered by the ordeal, could no longer bear the weight of her emotions. Her arms fell back to her side, and she slipped into a deep, merciful unconsciousness. Dr. Carleon and the midwives worked quickly to clean the child and ensure his survival. But Margaret's condition was far worse than they had anticipated. The damage to her body was extensive. Torn tissues, internal injuries, excessive blood loss, and an exhaustion so deep it threatened to consume her. It was a miracle that she was still alive, but the physical toll had been immense. She had been torn apart by the very act of bringing her son into the world, and the recovery would be long and uncertain. As dawn broke over Pembroke Castle, the first light of morning shone weakly through the small, narrow windows of the chamber. Outside, the storm that had raged all night seemed to finally subside, as if the world itself was offering a brief moment of peace. Inside, however, the battle for survival was far from over. Margaret, barely clinging to life, had given birth to the child who would one day become Henry VII, the king who would unite England and end the Wars of the Roses. And with that first, fragile cry of her son, the destiny of England began to shift. The future of the kingdom had been born in pain and blood, just as Margaret had been, born into a world of sacrifice and survival, where only the strongest would endure. The morning after the most agonizing night of Margaret Beaufort's life arrived with an eerie quiet. Inside the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, the world felt suspended, caught between the fragile life of a newborn and the broken body of a 13-year-old girl who had been torn apart by the very process that brought him into the world. Margaret lay unconscious, her body limp from exhaustion, and the future of England, the future of the Lancastrian cause, hung in the balance. The baby, the future Henry VII, was alive, but weak, barely breathing, his tiny body swaddled and rushed to the warmth of the hearth. The midwives and Dr. Carleon moved with a careful, practiced efficiency, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing both mother and child. The battle was not over. The future king, who would one day unite the warring factions of York and Lancaster, was barely hanging on. And Margaret's life, too, seemed to teeter on the edge of the abyss. For all the pain and bloodshed that had gone into this moment, there was little joy. The physical toll on Margaret's body was catastrophic. She had endured the unthinkable. A child of her own age, pregnant and laboring under conditions that should never have been forced upon a young girl. Her body, still developing, had never been ready for this, and it showed in every tear, every bruise, and the internal damage that no healer could repair. She would never bear another child. The trauma of this birth had robbed her of that future. But in the midst of this darkness, a light flickered. The baby, against all odds, let out a weak cry, a sound that sent shockwaves through the room. A life, fragile and raw, had entered the world, and with it, a new hope for the dying Lancastrian cause. Henry Tudor was born, a boy with the blood of kings running through his veins. the last hope for a dynasty that had teetered on the edge of oblivion for so long. Margaret's mind, clouded by the weight of pain, barely registered the moment. She had suffered beyond what any child should have had to endure. And now, on the brink of death, she clung to the thin thread of consciousness that connected her to the world around her. When her eyes opened, there, before her, was the tiny face of her son, the boy who would one day take the throne of England. In her fragile state, Margaret's strength was not enough to hold him. She reached for him instinctively, but her arms could barely lift, her body in too much pain to function properly. The midwife, Dame Gwen, who had been there through every moment of Margaret's suffering, placed the baby into Margaret's arms for just a fleeting moment. That brief connection, the first time mother and child truly met, was all Margaret could manage before the pain pulled her back into the oblivion of unconsciousness. As the hours stretched on, Margaret's condition worsened. The bleeding from her injuries had not stopped, and despite the best efforts of Dr. Carleon and the midwives, it seemed that her survival was uncertain. The young girl who had been thrust into the brutal world of marriage, politics, and dynastic ambition was now at the mercy of fate. Yet, despite all the suffering, the woman who had endured so much already refused to surrender. Outside, in the cold, cruel landscape of a kingdom locked in civil war, Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, paced the castle's stone corridors. He had been the one to bring her to Pembroke, to offer her protection and refuge. But now, as the weight of the moment settled upon him, he understood that he had no control over what was happening inside that chamber. Margaret's survival, and the survival of her son, was no longer in his hands. The future of England rested on the thin thread of life that connected mother and child. Jasper knew better than anyone how much was at stake. He had witnessed firsthand the carnage of the Wars of the Roses. His own family's position had been precarious for years, and now, with Henry Tudor's birth, everything seemed to hinge on this child's survival. Jasper, though a man of courage and resource, was no match for the forces of fate that were now at work. Inside the chamber, the battle continued. As the midwives worked tirelessly to keep Margaret alive, their hands were slick with blood, their faces grave with concern. They had done everything they could, but it was now a matter of time. Would Margaret survive this ordeal? Would the baby live? Would the Lancastrian line rise or fall in the face of a kingdom embroiled in endless war? As the hours stretched on, Margaret's body fought against the inevitable. She was young, and there was a strength in her that came from a life lived in constant turmoil. The pain and suffering she had endured had forged something within her, something fierce and unyielding. Margaret may have been broken physically, but her spirit had not been shattered. By the time Margaret regained consciousness once more, the world outside had changed. The midwives had succeeded in keeping the child alive, and though her body was in tatters, Margaret's heart swelled with a fierce love for the son she had brought into the world. Though her strength was still ebbing away, she managed to reach for him, to cradle him close to her chest, and for the first time, she held him properly. Her son, Henry, the future king of England. But the battle for survival was far from over. Margaret's body had been pushed to its limits, and the damage would last a lifetime. She would never be the same. Her reproductive years were stolen from her in a single night, and yet, against all odds, she had given birth to a child who would go on to unite the warring factions of England and become Henry VII. The boy who had been born in the bloodied chamber of Pembroke Castle would one day rise to take the throne, ending the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. As Margaret recovered, her role in the future of England became clearer. She would not be a mere mother in the traditional sense. The political landscape had already shaped her life in ways no one could have anticipated. Her motherhood had been forged in the furnace of dynastic politics, but it would be her intelligence, cunning, and resilience that would ensure her son's place on the throne. Margaret's body was fragile, but her mind was sharp. She knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. The Yorkists were not done, and the conflicts would continue. But Margaret had already proven that she could survive. She would do whatever it took to see her son crowned king, even if it meant navigating the brutal and dangerous world of medieval politics, where every alliance was fragile and every victory hard-won. As Henry Tudor grew, so too did his mother's resolve. Margaret's life, scarred by the brutality of childbirth and the trauma of political survival, had only just begun. But with Henry's first cries, the story of the Tudors had been set in motion. Her son, born of such suffering, would one day end the bloodshed and bring about the beginning of a new era for England. The days following Margaret's brutal childbirth passed slowly, each one a battle to hold on to life. Her recovery was agonizingly slow. Her body, broken by the traumatic birth, was slow to heal. For weeks, she hovered between life and death, her body racked with fever, her spirit sapped by the loss of so much blood. Her once vibrant face, now pale and drawn, seemed to mirror the desolation of the kingdom outside the castle walls. The Wars of the Roses raged on, and yet, within the fortress of Pembroke Castle, a more personal war was unfolding, a battle for survival and for the future of England itself. The damage done to Margaret's body was irreversible. Dr. Carleon, who had tended to her with his learned skill, whispered of internal injuries, torn muscles, and the lasting scars of a young girl whose body had not been ready for the horror it had endured. She would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had stolen her future as a mother in the traditional sense. Yet her sacrifice, her physical destruction, was not in vain. She had given life to the child who would one day be Henry VII, the man who would unite England and end the bloodshed of the Wars of the Roses. The emotional and psychological toll was perhaps even more severe than the physical. Margaret, despite her deep love for her son, could not help but feel the weight of what she had lost. The memories of the violent labor, the crushing pain, and the destruction of her body were too much for her young mind to process. In the weeks after the birth, Margaret began to withdraw, spending long hours in the castle chapel, praying for solace, seeking comfort in the presence of God. Her faith deepened, as though she sought refuge from the world that had forced her into such unimaginable suffering. She clung to her son in the only way she could, by immersing herself in the intense devotion of the motherhood. The pain of her body, the loss of her fertility, was tempered by the love she felt for Henry. But even this love was tainted by the fear and anxiety that accompanied it. She loved her son with every ounce of her being, but in the quiet hours of the night, when the castle was still, Margaret would be haunted by the memories of his birth. The connection between them was undeniable, yet her trauma lingered, like a shadow she could not escape. For all her love, Margaret could not completely silence the echoes of the past, the brutal reality of her life. Her early years marked by loss, her marriage to Edmund Tudor a political necessity, her body broken by childbirth, had shaped her in ways that could not be undone. The mother who held her son close now also held the scars of a life defined by sacrifice, loss, and survival. Her motherhood had been forged not in the tender moments of joy, but in the harshest of crucibles, and that would define her relationship with Henry in the years to come. Though Margaret's physical recovery was slow, her mind never ceased working. She had not only survived the birth of her son, but she had also survived the greater ordeal that was to come: the struggle to secure her son's place in a world still engulfed in civil war. Henry's birth had marked a new beginning for the Lancastrian cause, but the road ahead was far from certain. The Yorkists were powerful, and the political landscape of England was shifting rapidly. Margaret knew that the true test of her strength would be in the years to come, as she navigated the dangerous currents of medieval politics. She had already lost much: her childhood, her health, and the future she might have had. But what she still had was her son, and she would protect him with everything she had left. As the years passed, Margaret's role would shift from that of a passive pawn in a dynastic game to an active player, a strategist and survivor whose political savvy would become her most important weapon. While her health slowly improved, Margaret began to train herself in the ways of survival. She studied the men and women who moved the pieces on the political chessboard of 15th century England. She learned the art of negotiation, the intricacies of courtly life, and the value of alliances forged and broken in the blink of an eye. She was a quick study, for she understood that the fate of her son and of the Lancastrian cause depended on her ability to navigate the shifting tides of war and power. But even as Margaret steeled herself for the battles to come, there was still the undeniable, raw pain of what she had lost. Her relationship with her son was not without its complexities. The trauma of his birth, the physical destruction of her body, left its mark on Margaret in ways that would define her for the rest of her life. She loved Henry, but she could never completely shake the memories of the pain, the fear, and the fragility that had surrounded his arrival. Her devotion to him was fierce, but it was also shaped by the bitterness of sacrifice. It would take years for Margaret to heal, both physically and emotionally. But in those early months after Henry's birth, she began to understand something deeply important. Her strength lay not just in her ability to survive, but in her ability to fight for her son, for the Lancastrian cause, and for a future where his reign could bring peace to a kingdom fractured by war. Her journey would not be an easy one, but she had already proven that she could endure the unimaginable. Now, she would use every tool at her disposal to ensure that her son's place on the throne would one day be assured. Margaret Beaufort, the young girl who had screamed in agony on the cold stone floor of Pembroke Castle, had transformed into a woman of political acumen, a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her son's future. Her body might have been broken, but her spirit was not. Margaret would become a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose will was as unyielding as the stone walls that had surrounded her during the birth of England's future king. Margaret Beaufort, despite the immense personal sacrifice and the deep scars left by childbirth, knew the time had come to shift from survival to strategy. Her recovery was slow, but as her health slowly returned, so too did her resolve to see her son, Henry Tudor, placed on the throne. The traumatic events of the past few months had forged her into a woman of immense strength and purpose, and though she had been a mere child when her journey began, the woman she had become was a political force in her own right. Her suffering, her sacrifices, were now the foundation of her political ambitions. The future of England, as well as her own family's survival, lay in her hands. In the months following Henry's birth, Margaret knew her son's survival depended not only on their immediate protection, but on navigating the dangerous political landscape of England. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and with every passing day, the Yorkists, emboldened by their growing power, grew more threatening. Richard, Duke of York, and his sons had grown in influence, and their claim to the throne was now viewed as the most legitimate by the kingdom. In contrast, Henry VI's reign appeared weak and increasingly unstable, especially with the persistent rumors surrounding his mental health and his incapacity to rule. Margaret's position was precarious. She was a widow, the mother of a newborn son, and a supporter of the Lancastrian cause, which seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Henry Tudor was just an infant, and while his bloodline gave him a claim to the throne, he was still a child in a kingdom that was in the midst of a brutal civil war. The political alliances Margaret needed to secure in order to safeguard her son's future were frail at best, and the shifting allegiances of the nobility made survival even more difficult. But Margaret was not easily discouraged. Her life had already been marked by betrayal, loss, and tragedy. She had faced hardships that many could never imagine. She understood the value of political maneuvering, the importance of alliances, and the deadly consequences of losing one's place in the Game of Thrones. With her son's future in mind, Margaret began to surround herself with key figures who could aid her cause, those whose loyalties she could win or at least manipulate. She would need to build a network, quietly and strategically, to protect Henry and restore the Lancastrian cause. She began by cementing her relationship with her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, who had always been loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Jasper's support was invaluable. Not only did he share Margaret's desire to see Henry on the throne, but he also had a deep understanding of the political currents that would shape their future. Together, they plotted their course carefully, understanding that they needed to be both patient and cautious. The Yorkists were not to be underestimated, and Margaret knew that every misstep could cost her son's life. Meanwhile, Margaret was becoming a master of diplomacy. She understood that survival meant more than just holding on to power. It meant securing alliances that could give Henry a fighting chance when the time came. Her connection to the powerful Beaufort family, with its royal blood, was her strongest asset. But she also knew that political power was about more than blood. It was about influence, relationships, and timing. Margaret was a quick learner, and her keen mind began to devise the plans that would carry her through the most difficult years of her life. As Henry grew, Margaret's role as his protector and political strategist became even more pronounced. Her devotion to him was unwavering, but she also understood the importance of keeping her son's potential hidden from those who would use him as a pawn in their own game. The Lancastrian cause was failing, but Margaret still believed that Henry could be its salvation. She would use every resource at her disposal and every moment of her life to see her son rise from the ashes of civil war and claim the throne that was rightfully his. But it wasn't just Henry's future that Margaret had to secure. It was her own survival. As the Yorkists' power grew, so did the threat to the Tudor family. Margaret's path was one of constant vigilance, as she navigated the ever-changing allegiances and power struggles of the English nobility. She knew that in order to keep Henry safe, she would need to protect herself as well. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor had already demonstrated the brutal reality of dynastic politics. Margaret had lost so much, and now she would stop at nothing to ensure her son's future. Despite the overwhelming odds, Margaret's determination only grew. She knew that her actions would shape the destiny of England, and that the sacrifices she had made were just the beginning. Henry's birth had marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, but the fight for the throne was far from over. Margaret had already proven that she could survive the unthinkable. Now it was time for her to prove that she could be the mastermind behind her son's rise to power. The years ahead would not be easy. Margaret would face betrayal, heartbreak, and countless challenges, but she would meet each one with the resilience that had come to define her. She would form alliances with women as well as men, understanding that the bonds between women, though often overlooked, were just as crucial in the struggle for power. Margaret's strategy would be one of patience, cunning, and diplomacy, working from the shadows to ensure that Henry's claim to the throne would be unchallenged when the time came. And when that time came, Margaret would be ready. She had already lost so much, but she had learned that nothing, not even the agony of childbirth or the destruction of her body, could defeat her. Her son, Henry Tudor, would be the one to lead the Tudor dynasty to its ultimate victory, and Margaret would be the one to ensure that his path was clear, no matter what it took. Her sacrifice had been great, but so too was her determination. Margaret Beaufort had already weathered the worst of England's storms, and now she was poised to steer her son to a future he could not yet imagine. As the years passed, the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses raged on, each day a step further into the unknown. England, still divided between the houses of York and Lancaster, was a land where loyalties shifted like sand, and no one was ever truly safe. Margaret Beaufort's life had been a series of constant adjustments, one after another, but the ultimate test was still ahead. For Margaret, the stakes were higher than ever before. Her son, Henry Tudor, represented the last hope of the Lancastrian cause, and his survival depended on her ability to outwit, outlast, and ultimately overcome the Yorkists who had all but claimed the throne. Margaret had spent the years following Henry's birth consolidating power in the shadows. She had been forced to live in a state of constant vigilance, always calculating her next move. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor had been a political arrangement, and now her son, the last remaining male heir of the Lancaster line, was a focal point of both hope and danger. The Lancastrian faction had lost ground, and Henry VI's reign, already shaky, was becoming more and more fragile. In 1461, the Yorkist forces, under Edward IV, secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton. It seemed the Yorkists would dominate England, and the Lancastrians were all but destroyed. Yet Margaret, though surrounded by loss, never gave up. She understood the true weight of her son's claim to the throne. It was not just about power, it was about survival. Henry was just a boy, living in exile, far from the throne he was destined to inherit. But Margaret's determination had been set in motion long before, and she had already begun the most daring game of her life. As her son remained under the care of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, in Wales, Margaret knew that he was safe, for now. But she also knew that a child in exile could easily be forgotten. And so Margaret turned her attention to building relationships with powerful figures who might help support Henry's cause. The death of her second husband, Henry Stafford, in 1471, after a lingering illness, was another reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Stafford's death left Margaret with more freedom to act, but it also intensified the urgency of her plans. The final gamble was now at hand. She would fight not just for survival, but for her son's future. With Henry in exile and Margaret back in England, she began to form new alliances, ones that would have far-reaching consequences. Her political acumen, honed over years of suffering and strategy, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The Yorkists had secured their hold over England, but their power was fragile. Richard III's reign, built on a cloud of suspicion and intrigue, had alienated many of his supporters. The time had come to strike, not openly, but with calculated precision. Margaret knew that timing was everything. Through carefully planned letters, subtle alliances, and clandestine meetings, Margaret began to orchestrate a rebellion against Richard III. The Duke of Buckingham, once a staunch Yorkist, had grown disillusioned with Richard's reign, and Margaret knew that he might prove to be an ally in her quest to restore the Lancastrians to power. However, Margaret also understood the danger of overextending herself. Any move she made had to be precise, for any misstep could cost her son his life. In 1470, Margaret made a daring choice. She joined forces with Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once an enemy, but now a man whose ambition was as vast as her own. Warwick, known as the Kingmaker for his ability to topple monarchs, had fallen out of favor with the Yorkists. Together, they formed an alliance that would change the course of English history. Warwick would restore Henry VI to the throne, but this came at a great cost. Margaret knew that the political landscape had shifted again, and the stakes were higher than ever. The risk was enormous, but Margaret's gamble was one of desperation and determination. She had already lost so much, but she was willing to risk everything for her son's future. When Warwick succeeded in restoring Henry VI to the throne, it seemed for a moment that the Lancastrian cause had been reborn. But the triumph was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile in 1471 with a force that quickly regained control of the kingdom. In two decisive battles, at Barnet and Tewkesbury, Warwick's forces were crushed, and the Lancastrian cause was all but wiped out again. The loss was devastating. Henry VI was murdered, and the last major Lancastrian opposition to the Yorkists was vanquished. Richard III's reign seemed secure once more. Yet, Margaret's resolve never wavered. With the political tide once again turned against her, she faced the hardest decision of all. Richard III's grip on the throne seemed unshakable, but Margaret knew that her son's time had not yet passed. Despite all the loss, all the suffering, the goal was still within reach. Henry Tudor, though in exile, had one final chance to claim the throne, and Margaret would see him crowned king, even if it meant risking everything once more. In September 1471, the final gamble was set into motion. Jasper Tudor, who had kept Henry safe all these years, prepared the young man for the challenges ahead. Henry would need to land in England, and he would need to do so with the support of key figures. Figures who could make the difference between victory and death. It was now or never. Henry Tudor sailed from Brittany to Wales, where his uncle Jasper had gathered a small force. The odds were overwhelming. Richard III still held the throne, and the Yorkist forces were strong. Yet Margaret's gamble, her unflinching belief in her son's destiny, had been building to this moment. Henry's landing in Wales would spark the final battle for the throne, the moment that Margaret had waited for her entire life. When the forces of Richard III met Henry's army at the Battle of Bosworth on August 20, 1485, Margaret's gamble came to fruition. The Stanleys, whom Margaret had cultivated a relationship with over the years, turned the tide at the critical moment, siding with Henry instead of Richard. The result was a decisive victory for Henry Tudor and the death of Richard III. With his death, Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret's path had not been easy. She had sacrificed her body, her happiness, and the simple joys of motherhood to secure her son's place on the throne. But now, in this moment of triumph, she had achieved what she had worked for all her life. Her son, Henry VII, had ascended to the throne, ending the Wars of the Roses and founding a dynasty that would shape the course of England's history for centuries to come. Margaret Beaufort, who had once screamed in agony in the cold stone chambers of Pembroke Castle, had seen her dream fulfilled. Through every sacrifice, through every betrayal, through every moment of pain, she had emerged victorious. The future of England was now secured in the hands of her son, and the Tudor legacy, begun in the fires of conflict and sacrifice, had been set into motion. The death of Richard III on the muddy battlefield of Bosworth was the turning point that sealed not only the fate of the Yorkists, but the future of England itself. As Henry Tudor claimed the throne as Henry VII, a new dynasty was born. And Margaret Beaufort, the mother who had endured so much, stood at the heart of it all. The days of bloodshed were not over, but the long wars of the Roses, the struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster, had finally come to a close. The Tudor dynasty was now in power, and the political landscape of England had been irrevocably changed. Margaret had witnessed the destruction of her family, the rise and fall of kings, and the shifting allegiances that defined her life. She had been through the worst of it, the traumatic birth of her son, the loss of her first husband, and the bitter betrayals that had scarred her journey. Yet through it all, Margaret never faltered. She had kept her eye on the ultimate prize, securing Henry's place on the throne. Her sacrifices, both personal and political, had paved the way for her son's success, and in doing so, she had ensured the survival of the Lancastrian cause. Now that her son was king, Margaret's role was far from over. Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, owed his crown to the years of hard work and dedication Margaret had poured into securing his future. Though she would never rule in her own right, Margaret's influence remained immense. She was now the most powerful woman in England, her position solidified by her son's success and her own unshakable will. As Queen Mother, Margaret took on a vital role in Henry VII's court. She was not only a political advisor, but also a mother who cared deeply for her son's reign. Despite the political intrigue that surrounded the young king, Margaret's influence on her son was undeniable. She had always been a strategic thinker, and now, in the shadow of the throne, she continued to shape the course of England's future. Margaret's devotion to her son was clear. She would guide him, protect him, and, if necessary, fight for his reign. She knew that Henry's position was still precarious, and the old Yorkist supporters had not entirely faded away. For all her sacrifices, Margaret was also haunted by what she had lost. The trauma of her childhood, the pain of her early marriages, and the devastation of the birth that had nearly claimed her life were all indelible marks upon her soul. Yet, despite the deep emotional scars, she understood the necessity of her role in the Tudor dynasty. She had done what was required, what was demanded of her by fate and by history. And she had done it with grace, resilience, and an unyielding desire to see her son on the throne. Margaret's life was a testament to the harsh realities of medieval England, where power was won and lost in the most brutal of ways. She had borne the physical cost of dynastic ambition, but she had also shown that maternal love, when tempered with political acumen, could be the greatest weapon of all. Margaret's legacy was more than just the foundation of the Tudor dynasty. It was the quiet, unspoken strength that allowed her son to rise above the bloodshed and claim what was rightfully his. As Henry VII secured his reign, Margaret's role shifted from a mother of a king to a matriarch who would shape the future of the Tudor family. The marriage of Henry to Elizabeth of York in 1486 solidified the union of the two warring houses and ended the bitter conflict that had torn England apart for so long. Their union, forged in the crucible of war and bloodshed, would produce the future kings and queens of England, including the infamous Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the latter becoming one of the most iconic rulers in English history. Margaret, who had once lived in the shadows, became a central figure in her son's court. Her wisdom, her connections, and her sheer determination helped steer the Tudor dynasty through its early struggles. She was a queen mother in every sense of the word, not just in title but in the vital role she played in ensuring the success of her son's reign. Her strength was evident in the way she handled the various challenges that arose during Henry's reign, from external threats to internal political struggles. Margaret's legacy would not only be defined by her political contributions, but by the way she shaped the dynasty she had helped establish. She had given birth to a king, but she had also been a guiding force behind his success. In the annals of English history, Margaret Beaufort would be remembered not only as the mother of Henry VII, but as a woman who had endured the unthinkable and emerged as one of the most powerful and influential figures of her time. Her death in 1509, just days after Henry VII's coronation, marked the end of an era. But the Tudor dynasty she had helped to establish would go on to change the course of history. Margaret's sacrifice, the price she paid for her son's crown, was not just a personal tragedy, but a cornerstone upon which the future of England was built. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, marked by a simple inscription, is a testament to the extraordinary life of a woman who was both mother and strategist, a survivor and a queen mother. Margaret's journey from a screaming child in the cold stone chambers of Pembroke Castle to the matriarch of a dynasty that would define English history is a story of sacrifice, endurance, and unyielding ambition. In the end, Margaret Beaufort's legacy was not just her bloodline, but the kingdom her son would go on to rule, one that would endure through centuries of change. Her story is a testament to the power of maternal love, political ingenuity, and the unbreakable will of a mother determined to see her son on the throne, no matter the cost.